Hello and welcome to Stand With Us TV Live. Stand With Us is working around the clock, supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism. Thank you for joining us. We have a great show for you today. Coming up, I'll be joined by a U.S. Senator who has a long, distinguished, and strikingly independent career in public service. Elected to the Senate as a Democrat, he was his party nominee for vice president in the 2000 U.S. election, the first American Jew to be nominated on a major party ticket. For 24 years, Senator Joe Lieberman was a member of the U.S. Senate from Connecticut. At the end of his service in 2013, he served as the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee chairman and a senior member of the Armed Services Committee. Among his many accolades, Senator Lieberman served on the board of several nonprofit organizations. He is a proud supporter of bipartisan relations and a true friend of the State of Israel. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Senator Joe Lieberman. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with Stand With Us.
Well, thank you, Peggy. Great to be with Stand With Us, and happy 20th birthday. You've made a real difference in the first 20 years, and you'll make even more in the second 20.
I hope so. Can you share with the viewers how you first decided to go into politics?
Yes. Well, I've thought about that as I look back. I was very lucky in all the years of opportunity I had to serve. So there was no moment, when the light went on. But I've concluded that there are three factors at work. One was the religious upbringing I had. I grew up in a religiously observant home. My parents, my rabbi had taught us we had an obligation to be involved in the world around us and to try to make a difference, to try to make it better. That was our obligation from the Torah. The second, a little later, when I was in high school and college, I started to read history and biography, and I was so struck by the impact of leaders, for good or bad, on the lives of people who they led. And the final thing I think that moved me was that I had some great role models. One was a man who was the governor of Connecticut, later became a senator, Abe Ribicoff, first Jewish governor in Connecticut's history. I was just a little boy when he was elected, but I got to know him and he became a mentor to me. And then John F. Kennedy in 1960 really drew not just me, but many people in my generation into politics. That famous phrase from his inaugural address in January of 1961, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That really resonated with me and a lot of others. And frankly, it sort of touched what I had been taught by my parents and rabbi about being of service. So it began to develop in me as time went on. When I arrived at college, I was lucky enough to go to Yale. If you asked me what I was going to do when I got out, I really wouldn't have known. I just wanted to make sure I didn't flunk out and embarrass my family. But when I came out of law school 7 years later, if you asked me what I was going to do, I wouldn't have told you the truth, unfortunately, because it was too presumptuous. I probably would have said, I'm going to practice law. I was lucky enough to be hired by a good law firm here in New Haven, Connecticut, and maybe someday I would go into public service. The truth is, I already had formed a very specific goal or dream, and that was to be a United States Senator. Maybe that was because Abe Ribicoff had been a United States Senator, and I worked for him a little bit. Anyway, I was lucky enough in my life to live the dream. And then to have a chance to run for vice president in 2000, wow, that was way beyond my dream. So, Baruch Hashem, I've been blessed, really.
So I've followed your career, and I admire you because you always seem to do what's right, despite the critics, despite the decline of partisanship over time. So it's important. What are your concerns about the U.S.-Israel relationship in an increasingly polarized political environment?
Well, that's a really important question. And let me say that I am concerned about maintaining bipartisan support for Israel in Congress and among the American people in a time of really terrible, almost crippling, disabling partisanship in our politics. For most of the time I was in the Senate, that was 1989 to 2013, there was overwhelming bipartisan support for Israel, for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. And I used to say, and it was true, that presidents come and go, prime ministers of Israel come and go. Usually in every presidential term, the president has some good things for Israel and some that are questionable. But the real guarantor of the U.S.-Israel relationship was this strong bipartisan majority, both houses, for the U.S.-Israel relationship and a strong Israel. And that began to break a little bit, certainly around the Iran nuclear agreement between the U.S., some of the other major powers in Europe and Asia, and Iran, where a lot of us, including me, fought very hard against that agreement. We thought it was bad for the U.S., bad for Israel, bad for the Arab countries in the Middle East, bad for security in the world. And the vote on that really broke on partisan lines. The Democrats supporting President Obama, Republicans opposing. And it was a real crack in that relationship. So now, as the Biden administration has gone back into negotiations with Iran, I must say I'm concerned about it. President Biden, Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, all have assured us, me, that they're not going to remove the sanctions unless Iran agrees to a longer, stronger agreement, which is a way of saying that the original agreement was not a good agreement. And of course, I agree. But we worry nonetheless that Iran lies, cheats, and will make promises it won't keep. The sanctions on Iran, which are hurting them, and the reason why they want to come back so much into the agreement, if they're taken off, even in part, the motivation for Iran to stay at the table and negotiate what we really should be demanding, which is an end to their nuclear program, period, an end to their support of terrorism, and an end to their terrible repression of the human rights of the people of Iran. So that Iran has really created a breach here. There's something else going on, of course, which is that there are elements within the Democratic Party, and they're a minority, really, that are far left and are not showing the kind of support that members of both parties, including the majority of Democrats still today, show for Israel. And those of us who care a lot about the U.S.-Israel relationship have to redouble our effort to make the case for Israel. I will tell you this, and this always gives me comfort. If you follow public opinion polls, the American people, leaving aside Congress for a moment, continue to be very positive in both parties toward Israel. And that's ultimately what should affect members of Congress and guarantee a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. But all of us who care about Israel, care about America, have always felt the security and freedom and prosperity of both go up or down together. We have work to do right now, but we'll do it, and I'm optimistic.
Yeah. On Iran, are there any chances, or what are the chances of the Senate being able to set up some road guards against appeasement?
Well, there is some legislation now being put in, mostly by Republican senators. There are a few Democrats thinking about it, which would require the administration, or any administration, I presume, to come to Congress for ratification of any new agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons or anything else, and including removal of sanctions, because the sanctions have been adopted by law. I think that's a good move, but I want to step back and say that I'm privileged to be the chair of a group called United Against Nuclear Iran, bipartisan group started around 2008 or 9 by Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, a Democrat. Well, I guess he was a Democrat, and Ambassador Dennis Ross, probably an independent, but just both real nonpartisan diplomats. And the aim is to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And this group, United Against Nuclear Iran, has been appealing to the Biden administration to use the negotiations with Iran as an opportunity to do two things that President Biden said he wants to do. One is to restore some bipartisanship to Washington. So we say the best way to do that is work with Congress. You're not going to get every member of both parties in Congress to support anything, but get some members of both parties to support whatever new nuclear agreement with Iran is being contemplated. And the second, of course, is President Biden has been very outspoken, and I know he means it to distinguish himself from President Trump. He wants to rebuild alliances around the world, America's alliances. But, that doesn't just relate to Europe and Asia. That relates to the Middle East. And that means that the U.S. should not enter into any agreement which is opposed by the Arab allies of ours and by Israel. And they think quite a lot alike on this question of Iran. So I think if the president does that, he has an opportunity not only to rebuild alliances and do something bipartisan, but Congress will adopt and stand with him in a way that will be lasting. Remember, President Obama forced the Iran nuclear agreement of 2015 through on a partisan vote. And what happened when we had the next president, Republican Donald Trump? He withdrew from the agreement. It wasn't law. And that's a good lesson for President Biden and every president. You want to do something that lasts, get bipartisan support, do it by law, and then it will last.
I agree with you 100%. Perhaps trying to make it a treaty would have been much better.
Yes, I mean, when President Obama decided to make it an executive agreement, then the numbers twisted. If it was a treaty, he would have get 2/3 of the Senate. With an executive agreement, we had to get at least 60 to break a filibuster, and probably 67 to override a veto. And I forgot the number, but we got 55 or thereabouts, and it wasn't enough.
Yeah, I remember that well. Another big issue that's very troubling is the International Criminal Court. They recently ruled that they have jurisdiction over Israel, even though Israel, just like the United States, is not a member. It seems that ICC has overstepped its authority because it's only meant to intervene in states that don't have functioning judiciaries. And as we know, Israel's judiciary is a model for the world. So there's a potential for every Israeli who served in the IDF to have a secret arrest warrant issued. If it works with Israel, they can do the same with the U.S., and who's not a member. So what can Congress do to push back against this politicized international judiciary?
Well, first, I totally agree with your criticism of the ICC and your attitude. I mean, this is, I guess you'd say, a good idea that went very bad. I mean, the good idea, I gather, was to build on, well, the experience, for instance, at the Nuremberg trials. But what happened is that right from the beginning, I think they call it the Rome Treaty that enacted the International Criminal Court, it became a political and not a judicial court. Now, there are some cases where, as you said, Peggy, the home country does not have an independent judicial system. So a court like this can apply justice to, for instance, leaders who've been corrupt or dictatorial or even supported genocide. But it has no jurisdiction over countries like the U.S. and Israel, which have not joined. And I was part of the debate in Congress about the U.S. We didn't want to join for exactly the same reason that Israel didn't join. We thought that that this court might, for political reasons, take off after American soldiers and hold them criminally accountable for their service to America following orders of American civilian and military leaders. So Congress can speak out against the International Criminal Court, and it has done some of that. There's not much support for this prosecution in Congress. There may be just a few people who are open to it, this prosecution or investigation now of Israel. It's very one-sided and very unfair to Israel, but it does have implications. The other, obviously, is that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court runs the risk in this case of really destroying the court, because it will be seen as just a political body, not really a legal or judicial body. At some point, it's possible, because it is related, and I apologize, I forgot exactly the connection to the United Nations, that there could be a move to deny the court funding and perhaps to end it altogether under that Rome Treaty. But I think Israel and the U.S. are going to be okay, because the court has, under this particular prosecutor, lost a lot of its legitimacy and credibility. But we can't take it for granted. And I think anybody in Congress or group of people in Congress who speak out against it, who try to figure out what they can do to take action to stop these prosecutions, they'd be doing the right thing.
And yeah, perhaps using international leverage to get member nations to say non-compliance with this ruling. Yeah. Correct. So we have thousands of people watching. If you write in the chat, tell us where you're from. A little while, we'll start asking questions and get to as many as possible. I want to tell you, Senator, you have been involved in a new documentary, which I saw, Upheaval, about the life of Menachem Begin. It's produced by Rob Schwartz.
His whole vision for Israel was for Jews to come here, feel like it's a safe haven.
באיזה סגנון אתה מתכוון להיות ראש ממשלה?
סגנון יהודי טוב.
What he want to say is stay straight.
שנסו מותניכם, חזקו רוחכם.
Very different from my political views, but I think he was one of the greatest leaders that Israel had.
Menachem Begin believed in the need for the Jews to seize their future.
Begin was very much a survivor.
Never again. There won't be another Holocaust in the history of the Jewish people.
He was described as being anti-democratic, but he proved to be the most democratic of all.
He had faith in his convictions and a very clear view of the way that things are supposed to go.
He was a hero for all the Jewish Ethiopian community.
No more war.
He had the credibility to make the first peace with an Arab nation.
He was a man of profound contradictions.
Both sides were engaged in an existential fight.
Israel has nothing to apologize for.
Menachem Begin, with all his faults, belonged to a different class of leader.
You rise, you struggle, and guarantee the prospect of living in peace for your children and their children.
The film is a beautifully nuanced story of Israel's independence and fight for survival, as told through the lens of Menachem Begin. I think we can learn a lot from Begin's story.
This is a very personal story at the beginning. Rob Schwartz is from New Haven, Connecticut, where I lived most of my life, really. His dad, Max, had a store there, and he was just a wonderful person. We all knew him in our neighborhood. Rob worked for me for a while when I was the state Senate Majority Leader, and then he managed one of my campaigns years ago. Eventually moved out to Denver, and he was in government relations. His son is now involved. But he's a very proud supporter of Israel, a Zionist in the fullest sense of that term. And in his own study of Zionist history, and I know as a result of a visit to that wonderful Begin Museum in Jerusalem, he just wanted to do something to honor and perpetuate Begin's memory. And he came to me early on and asked me what I thought, and I said, I'll help you in any way I can. But he really did it. This is a great story of one person with a dream and a mission. He raised the money that was necessary. He brought on a brilliant director, filmmaker, Jonathan Gruber. The film is, I guess, going to formally launch in June. It's called The Upheaval. It's very well done. It's very moving. And Begin is a hero and lived a remarkable life, starting in Brest, and I guess it was Belarus. Zionist family, was influenced by the great Jabotinsky, got involved in Zionism, was actually arrested for a while in Poland, went to Israel, I guess in the 30s, maybe the 40s, became a member of and then the leader of the Irgun, which was the other group, the more militant, you might say, group, other than the Haganah, which was fighting for Israel's independence, and he lived underground for a while covertly. He was involved in activities against the British to encourage them to leave. But what comes out, and he got into politics after statehood. He formed and led the Herut Party, Freedom, which ultimately became the base of Likud that exists today. It's a remarkable story. He was a great orator, and you see this in the film. And he was a great patriot. He was involved in the famous Altalena incident where Ben Gurion ordered, of all people, by coincidence, the commander of the Haganah on site, who was Yitzhak Rabin, to fire on this ship, the Altalena, with refugees coming in, but carrying weapons, because Ben Gurion thought there had to be one government, one force. And Begin, unbelievably at that point, said to his troops on the Altalena, we will not fire back. And why? Because we will not be involved in a civil war against other Jews, other Zionists, so soon after the Holocaust to show him. And listen, this happened in his political career. In 1967, he immediately went in and offered, I guess it was Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, to form a unity government. He was on the outs from the beginning of the Herut Party. until the late 70s. I think it was 77. And he got elected in 77. For all those decades, from 48 to 77 or 78, Mapai or Labor won every election. It was the dominant party. And then it was shocking in Israel that Begin won. Part of it was there was dissatisfaction finally with the Labor Party, but part of it was that he mobilized. I mean, here he is, this European Ashkenazic figure, but he reached out to the growing Sephardic community, and he gave them credibility, and they voted for him in great numbers, and he got elected. And of course, the remarkable thing is he was quite, I guess today conventionally we'd say right wing. He believed in strong Israel, but he was the one who made with Sadat an incredible breakthrough for Israel. He also was the one who ordered the attack on the Iraqi nuclear facility, which wiped it out. And his words, he's brilliant. And you will see him speak in this film in a way that speaks to us today, to be proud Jews, wherever you are. You could be faithful to your country, America, Europe, whatever, but be proud Jews and remember how important Israel is, not just to Jews, but to the world, and to support it honorably. And ultimately, don't put your own political interest ahead of a cause that is larger than yourself. And that's what he did throughout his career.
Yeah, it's a lesson in moral leadership that everyone can use. In fact, I was lucky enough, I saw a screener of the film before release, and we are showing it. We're having a special showing on June 15th with what we call our Zionist Movie Club with the director of the film. The lesson of, not attacking one another, building unity, certainly a lesson for then and a lesson for today. I know our time is very limited. I would like to get to a couple questions I have Josh in New York here, and he writes, the Abraham Accords opened the door for peace in the Middle East. What can Congress do to encourage the expansion and durability of these peace agreements?
That's a really important question, because these Abraham Accords, peace, diplomatic relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, really quite remarkable breakthrough that a lot of us couldn't have imagined. I knew, because I visited all these countries, and of course Israel, that there was active dialogue between them and Israel. And part of it was because they both shared a concern about Iran and how it menaced them, this radical Islamic regime in Iran. But part of it was that they began to realize in these Arab countries, beginning with the UAE, that they didn't have anything to fear from Israel. In fact, there were natural ways in which they could cooperate and build better lives for their own citizens. And I think Congress, so listen, I don't believe those Abraham Accords would have happened unless President Trump had pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement, strongly supported both Israel and the Arab world, and they felt confidence to come together. So I think part of the lesson is that Congress has to continue to do that, to make clear that we're on their side. The second is to give whatever support we can to joint ventures between the Arabs and the Israelis. And I'd say the most important thing would be to try to use our influence with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to encourage the Saudis to open up diplomatic relations with Israel. And obviously, Saudi Arabia is a very important country in the Middle East. And the king is the custodian of the two holy mosques, which are important to all Muslims in the world, certainly every Sunni Muslim, but Shia too. And this would be a real opportunity to not only begin to open the door to political settlement, but to say what a lot of Saudis have said to me, there should be no breach between us religiously, between Islam and Judaism. These are monotheistic faiths and share a lot of common history and values. And I agree with that.
So we have so many questions coming in from everywhere. Maybe we have time for one more. From Sarah from Vermont. And it's a question I have too. People are seeing an increased number of members of the House and the Senate who are criticizing and misrepresenting Israel, and they seem not to understand the strategic asset that Israel is to the U.S. How can we educate Congress on the benefits of our alliance?
Right. We have to have patience, and we have to be direct. I mean, when I say patience, I don't mean to be quiet. We really have to go to Washington, talk to our representatives, and tell them the truth. I mean, what has tied Israel and the U.S. together is not politics. We have common values. I mean, you know, when I grew up in America, there was something referred to as the Judeo-Christian tradition. So I realized as I got older and involved in politics that this really mattered to a lot of Christians, that they valued it. For a lot of Jews, it made them uncomfortable. But what it really meant is that we come from the same source. Again, one God. And, you know, as we know now with the powerful pro-Israel Christian evangelical movement, that's part of what's in their theological DNA. And but here's the point. So throughout my time in Washington, it was some people asked me, did you feel like you had a conflict of interest between supporting America and supporting Israel? Of course not.
Yeah.
We had the same values, the same interests, and the same enemies. And I think we've got to educate people. Now, a lot of the people in Congress who are saying these terrible things about Israel are to the left. But it's so odd because Israel is by far the most liberal country in the Middle East for all sorts of people. And you walk on the streets of Israel, you hear people with accents and languages from all over the world, French, Spanish, etc. And of course, we see now this growing and thank God, increasingly integrated Ethiopian Jewish community there. So really, and women's rights, gay rights, everything that people on the left in America value, there's no comparison to Israel. So, okay, you want to disagree with one policy, but don't make Israel into a demon that it is not. Just use your eyes, go to Israel, meet people, and listen to your constituents. So I'd say to, was it Sarah in Vermont, that go see Senator Sanders and Senator Leahy, and talk about what you feel. Hey, Peggy, it's been great with you.
And thank you so much, Senator Joe Lieberman, for joining us. Thank you for your service and your dedication to the U.S. and for being a true friend of the U.S.-Israel relationship and an inspiration to us all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very kind.
Don't forget, we're live at this time every second Sunday. And in between those live Sundays, watch the great shows you've missed, like interviews with Ambassador Michael Oren, Tracy Ann Oberman, Colonel Richard Kemp, Professor Judea Pearl, Ambassador Danny Danan, and so many others. Go to StandWithUs.tv, where you'll find a ton of great video content available at no cost any time of day. And on Sunday, May 23rd, right here on Stand With Us TV, we will be celebrating our 20-year anniversary with you. Tune in at 6 o'clock in your time zone and join us for an unforgettable evening of music, comedy, and memories. And don't forget, if you love the work Stand With Us does and want to support it, you can do so by going to StandWithUs.tv. stand.with.us.com/donate. We look forward to seeing you again, and thank you for standing with us. Shalom from Stand With Us.